basis. And let me ask you a couple of questions, if you can take this back to your group as to how to address these. What type of penalty would you have for the company if cab is privately leased and sometime, and then they hire different trailers on? How would you address this question to make sure there's a disincentive or an incentive that the companies themselves are closely checking with their contracted employees, because this is going to undermine the credibility of that system if in fact for the violators. Now they're going to be rare, but and there'll be spot checks, but it is a fundamental challenge to the fast pass system.
Well, actually, I suggest that that's, when it comes to commercial traffic, and just disagree with me if you do, that the real challenge, more than the companies or the shippers or the customs brokers or the things that are in the truck coming down the road, the challenge and concern is more frequently around the driver. Because the drivers are perhaps more apt to be the one who's trying to get away with something and, gee, I'll take something across the border in the cab with me, unbeknownst to the company or the others dealing with the process, which argues for the fact that we're certainly not in the foreseeable future going to get to the point where trucks are just going to plow down the road without stopping at the border, even though you know you've pre-cleared all the cargo and you really have no high concern about that, because you're still going to have those concerns about the drivers. And no matter how much you try to work with the shippers, with the trucking companies, to try to pre-clear or toughen background checks or so on, and I think some of that probably does need to be done. The reality is, going back to something you referred to earlier, with getting federal workers to do jobs. There's a crisis in this country and in Canada to get truck drivers. So it almost has come to the point, do you have a pulse and are you willing to drive a truck, and can you pass the driver's test? There's high turnover. It's endemic to the whole country and to Canada as well. And so that means that you're not going to have the stability or predictability with the actual drivers that you may have had 20 or 30 years ago. It's a challenge. I don't know that there's an easy answer. I think would have to be careful, though, in that context, of thinking that the answer is simply, well, let's penalize the company if some trucker happens to be driving a truck with their shipment and is trying to get away with something. Because there's a degree to which they can't control that, and particularly in an environment of current labor market for truck drivers. At the end of the day, somebody's going to take that truck down the road. So there needs to be vigilance in places like this with adequate facilities and staffing and technology to check those things that you had that kind of deterrent that Tom referred to.
Just to keep one more question, and you can comment on that last one as well, to kind of do a supplement to the last one and my last question, that in the trying to get the truckers accelerated, if the company is pre-cleared, generally still going to have to do checking. And last night we were looking at the differences if they leave gaps in their loads, it's easier to check. Other types of things, because if it doesn't do a whole lot of good to pre-clear the company, it would affect the drivers or other people at risk. I'd like to hear your comments on that. But then the last question is, I take it that you were and we'll be meeting with Border Patrol before I head back to Washington too, at their inland office, as well as the Coast Guard. So we're doing that as a supplement and get those things in the record. But part of the problem here is that I'm trying to figure out how much this is going to be a problem along multiple parts of the northern border and potentially the southern border, because Indian reservations and Indian nations are treated as independent nations. There's a different standard for law enforcement. At the same time, that has predominantly been for internal regulation reasons. We haven't had this extent of concern about smuggling. Now, smuggling is one thing in the traditional types of smuggling. As we move to more serious types of narcotics, and as we potentially push more towards those ones that are joint along the border, particularly if it's on both sides of the border, it becomes really problematic, which I understand the island in the river is a Canadian First Nations group, so you have it on both sides, and it really becomes a potential problem without a lot of cooperation if also terrorists move through that area. If you could give me some suggestions on how great you think the problem is, how vulnerable cooperation that you've had, other suggestions to deal with that, as well as walk across questions or the whole range of if you squeeze at one point besides Lake Champlain, where else, and the Indian Reservation, where else would be the point?
If I could just comment on what Gary said, he's absolutely right. It was kind of ironic as we built this new port project was that even people that I deal with in my union in Washington were amazed how chambers of commerce and people in the union could actually go down the same road together. And we've been down the same road together, and we have more in common on this issue than we do in opposition. And he's absolutely right about the drivers. And again, you have to kind of jump back and take, kind of a forest through the trees look and say, you're never going to be able to stop everything. You're never going to be able to get 100% certainty. The essence of law enforcement is to put the best deterrent forward that you can. And if we can do that type of stuff, we will screen most of the drivers. The freight that is pre-cleared, that is a separate issue to the conveyance. And that is also a time-consuming issue when they cross the border. There's the people that cross the border, and there's the conveyance and the merchandise that crosses the border. So if we can pre-clear some of this stuff and have a reasonable certainty that it is in compliance with law, that takes a lot of time away and lets us focus then on the driver. And we're very good at focusing on the driver. Even, as you say, you make a good point, and I can't say that we're always 100% sharp, but if you properly manage your caffeine, you can do it a little better than other people can. But you may miss, like you said, at Congress at 2 in the morning. There may be some nuances you may miss, but you're not going to miss a big thing. I don't care how tired you are, you do it every day. And the same is true with inspectors. So when we can focus on those drivers and get a lot of the other stuff out of the way, and especially with big companies like, in Detroit, the big three, there's not a lot in a GM shipment we're going to want to look at. And if we can pre-clear that, then we can focus our attention on the conveyance and the driver. So they're not mutually exclusive. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater on that. You don't want to say, well, why would I want to pre-clear these if I'm going to have driver problems anyway? You still get a net gain, is my point on the drivers. About the reservation, while they are separate entities, I find that our biggest problem is putting resources to the problem. It's not that we have a lack of cooperation. Many people, like many sovereign nations, do not want to participate in illegal activity. They do not want their land used for smuggling. There's a very small amount of people that will always, whenever you have anything for profit, back to the bootlegging days, will try to smuggle. And if we can get some type of resource, be it technology, human resources, or the best solution, I think, is a combination of both, then you have, again, that you're not there all the time, you're not going to be there all the time, but you're going to be there enough where people are going to think before they do this type of stuff. So you're going to have a reduction in what you're doing. And it is a problem with people walking around. Marijuana, the component in marijuana is THC. And back when marijuana first broke in this country, the rate of THC was like 3 or 4%. What's now is called hydroponic marijuana. The component of THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, is now up to 40, 50%. It is so potent, it is unbelievable. It is frightening. You talked about ecstasy. You're right on the money again. This port had an internal carrier, which is unheard of at a land border. Somebody that swallows drugs in condoms or in latex wrappings and then dispels them at a later time. It's a great way to smuggle. It's very difficult to detect. We actually caught one here smuggling ecstasy. So we are not immune from, ecstasy is a big ticket item. It comes in from Europe here. We don't do enough to target. And again, it's just a question of personnel and getting us all working together. We have resources in Canada. We could target some of the European flights. We could do a better job. It's not an impossible job. It's a daunting job, but it's not impossible. The walkers around, again, when you squeeze one place or another, the unfortunate thing about these borders is they were designed back in the turn of the century, and to have a border was a status thing. If you take South Dakota, for example, where there's a border and then there's 400 miles and a couple hundred bears, and that's it. That's not the case here. You will have a border crossing in Moores, and by the crow flies, a mile west, you'll have another border crossing. And then you go east, and then there's the Port of Champlain. It's not like if you put up the wrong technology at these border stations, you will actually force people to try to beat the system instead of vice versa, if you know what I mean, because the roads are all so intertwined and close together. It's not like a vast wilderness. There's all these ports that are kind of clustered along the border. And again, that's why I said in my statement, we have to make some decisions. If we want to keep these open, and I believe we do, we have to staff them adequately, and I don't think we will choke anything off per se. Conversely, if we put technology that is conducive to trying to be beat at one of these places, we will take and put it to those locations because it's not that far away.
Thank you. Do you have any other-
Just one question. Thomas, you talked about your canine office. Is it my understanding, it is my understanding, is my understanding correct that your access to a dog now is a dog that is trained for drugs only? Is that true?
That's correct.
So if you have an occasion where there is a suspected explosive, as I understand happened a few weeks ago, you actually have to bring a dog team either from Albany or Fort Drum.
Or actually, in that instance, Congressman, we were lucky enough to get a canine team from Montreal. That came
Or
down.
the Canadians.
Yeah, or the Canadians.
So, Mr. Chairman, it seems like a simple thing, but there's a potential, particularly in the winter, which in spite of how you may feel about it, is not here as yet. If they find a suspected package on this crossing, it could literally close it down for 3, 4, perhaps more hours while you're waiting your arrival of the dog just to sniff something that we hope turns out to be, baked cookies for Thanksgiving. So another small dedication of resources that could be shared, as Thomas said, amongst a number of points here, if you had a location of a dog team that had the explosive case.
May I, if I can, I want to clarify some numbers that you asked for earlier and how important it is, but you were looking for the impact on traffic figures here at Champlain. Actually, if you were to look at the truck and passenger car counts here for September 2001 compared to September 2000, they're almost right on the head, which would lead you to believe that, well, it really has had no impact. Traffic has held up. But the fact is, if you would then look at June, July, and August, you would see that for passenger car traffic, it was up 20% from a year earlier, and truck traffic was up significantly as well. So what we lost was the continuing growth rate in that traffic. But we are still, these folks are in fact still working with numbers here that are equal to what they were working with the year before. And as far as that loss, of course, that's something we actually want to get back as soon as possible.
Do you have any idea how much that was softening in the recession versus,
It hadn't been up until September.
so in August it was still?
Yes. In August, the car counts are up approximately 20%.
Well, I thank each one of you, and as you have additional information and suggestions, we're kind of in a short-term fast track in Washington, and I would assume that who knows where we're going to be, but we're not in a short-term war on terrorism or on drugs. The war on terrorism is now going to find out how difficult those who said we weren't succeeding in the war on drugs are now going to get a feeling for what it feels like to try to catch every terrorist, similar to like fighting child abuse or rape or spouse abuse. We fight those things because they're evil, not that we're going to completely defeat them. We have direct authorizing in oversight on the narcotics question, so we spend a lot of time in South America, and what we've seen is you put the pressure on in Colombia, then it moves back to Peru and Ecuador, and starts to move other places and trying to get a step ahead so we don't do the Vietnam syndrome where we're just enough behind that we have to keep escalating. And that's part of what we're trying to head off here, and to do it in a way because Americans want to be safer, but they also want to have jobs. They want to be able to own their home and pay their health insurance and be able to advance, and to do this in a way as our countries become more interdependent. I'm not from a border area, and we've lost a ton in NAFTA to Mexico. We've had our trade with Canada soar. It's an auto belt, and with the just-in-time inventory and other things, these parts are moving back and forth multiple times a day, and the entire nation is finding out how interconnected we are. both in a bad way and a good way. So hopefully we can continue to look at this. Thank you for your testimony. And with that, our hearing is adjourned.